They laughed when Patrick Doyle started digging hills across land nobody wanted. The ground was wet enough to swallow a boot, rocky enough to break a shovel, and poor enough that most farmers in the parish had already decided it wasn't worth fighting. But Patrick kept digging. Day after day, he lifted soil by hand, built it into long raised ridges, and carved narrow channels between them so the rainwater could escape. His neighbors called them lazy beds. They said a man would have to be lazy indeed to think such crooked little ridges could feed a family. Patrick didn't argue. He planted potatoes on some of them, oats on others, and flax where the soil allowed it. Then, in 1845, the potato blight came. Fields that had looked green and healthy in the morning began turning black within days. And suddenly, the strange ridges everyone had laughed at became something nobody in the parish could afford to ignore. Stay with this story until the end, because what happened on Patrick's little patch of Irish ground wasn't simply about one harvest. Decades later, farmers thousands of miles away, facing an entirely different disaster, would arrive at almost the same answer. Different country, different century, different catastrophe, but the same lesson. Sometimes the land isn't useless. Sometimes you've simply been asking it to grow the wrong way. Patrick Doyle had never owned much. His cottage stood on the western edge of a small farming community where the good ground belonged to families who had held it for generations. Their fields were broad and dark. The soil turned easily beneath a plow. When the rain came, the water drained away. Patrick's ground was different. It sat low, too low. After a heavy rain, water gathered in the hollows and stayed there. Stones rose through the soil like bones. A horse could pull a plow across the better sections, but much of Patrick's land was too wet and broken for ordinary cultivation. An older farmer once stood at the edge of it and shook his head. "You'd get more from the bog if you drained it." Patrick looked across the field. "I've been thinking about that." The farmer laughed. "Then think about something else." Patrick didn't. He had a wife, 2 children, and very little land to spare. He couldn't afford to wait for someone to give him better ground. So he decided to change the ground he already had. He began with a spade. He cut into the wet soil and turned it over. Then he cut another strip beside it. The earth he removed went onto the first strip, raising it above the surrounding ground. He kept going. Long ridge, narrow channel, long ridge, narrow channel, again and again. There was nothing elegant about it. No machine, no drainage crew, no grand agricultural theory, just one man moving earth with a shovel. By evening his hands were raw. By the end of the week his back ached every time he stood. And by the end of the month, his field looked as though someone had dragged a series of enormous parallel lines through it. His neighbors noticed. They also laughed. One called the ridges lazy beds. Another said Patrick had spent a month's labor making a field harder to walk across. Patrick listened. Then he went back to work. Because there was one thing the ridges did that the old flat ground had never done. They gave the water somewhere to go. Patrick learned quickly that the ridges were not magic. If he built them badly, they flooded. If he planted them too close together, they were difficult to work. If he ignored the channels, they filled with mud. So he adjusted. He changed the direction of some ridges, deepened certain channels, moved stones, built up the soil where it stayed too wet. The work became a yearly conversation between the farmer and the field. He watched where the rain gathered. He watched where the soil dried first. He learned which sections held moisture and which sections drained too quickly. And gradually, the land changed. The raised beds warmed faster than the waterlogged ground around them. The channels carried excess water away. The stones that had once seemed like nothing but obstacles became part of the structure. Then Patrick planted. Potatoes went into several ridges. But not all of them. He planted oats on others. Flax on another section. It wasn't because Patrick had some grand plan to revolutionize Irish agriculture. He simply understood something his neighbors didn't need to understand yet. If one crop failed, another might not. And in a country where a family's food could depend on a single harvest, that mattered. His neighbors still teased him. They saw potatoes growing on the ridges and thought he had finally found a use for all that unnecessary labor. They saw the oats and flax and considered them little more than side crops. The potato, after all, was productive. It grew well in Irish soil. It could feed a family from a relatively small piece of ground. For poor farmers, that productivity mattered enormously. Patrick knew it. He planted potatoes too, but he didn't plant only potatoes. That distinction would become important. In the summer of 1845, the fields looked ordinary. Green leaves, rows of potatoes, families working, children carrying baskets. Nobody knew exactly what was coming. Then the leaves began to darken. At first, people thought it was weather. Disease had damaged crops before. Fields recovered. Farmers had seen bad seasons and survived them. But this was different. The potato blight spread with frightening speed. Plants that looked healthy could collapse. Leaves turned dark. Stems weakened. And beneath the soil, potatoes that should have been food could rot. The news traveled from farm to farm. One man's crop was failing. Then another. Then an entire field. Patrick walked through his potato ridges and saw the same signs. The blight had reached him too. He pulled up a plant. The potatoes beneath it were damaged. Another plant. Worse. Another. Worse still. For a moment, the long hours he had spent building those ridges seemed meaningless. The land had not defeated the disease. Nothing had. But then Patrick walked farther. Past the potato beds. Past the worst of the blackened plants. Toward the sections where the oats were growing. They were still standing. The flax was still there too. Not untouched by the difficult weather. Not miraculous. But growing. Patrick stood in the field and understood the difference between losing a crop and losing everything. His potatoes were failing. But he still had something to harvest. That autumn, families across Ireland faced an increasingly desperate situation. For farmers who depended heavily on potatoes, the loss was devastating. Patrick's family did not have a good harvest. They did not suddenly become wealthy. They did not escape hardship. But they had oats. They had flax. They had something to trade. Something to eat. Something that could carry them into another season. The strange ridges had not saved Patrick because they had somehow defeated the blight. They had saved him because years earlier, he had refused to put everything his family needed into one crop. After the first devastating season, Patrick's neighbors looked at his land differently. Not all at once. Nobody likes admitting that the thing they laughed at might have been useful. But people began asking questions. How did he drain the wet ground? Why were his ridges built that way? What did he plant there? Could oats grow in those conditions? Could flax? Could the ridges be made on another piece of land? Patrick answered what he could. There was no secret. That was almost the disappointing part. He had simply watched the land. He had noticed what happened when water stayed. He had noticed what happened when soil was raised. He had noticed that one crop could fail while another survived. And he had worked accordingly. The ridges weren't a miracle. They were a system, a simple one. But simple does not mean easy. Every ridge represented labor. Every drainage channel represented another hour with a shovel. Every field required someone to understand its particular shape, moisture, stones, and slope. And that was perhaps why people had mocked Patrick in the beginning. His method was slow. It demanded patience. It didn't look impressive from a distance. There was no machine to point to. No large harvest to boast about. Just rows of earth built by hand. But sometimes resilience looks unimpressive before you need it. Nearly 90 years later and thousands of miles away, American farmers were facing a different kind of disaster. The Dust Bowl had turned parts of the Great Plains into a landscape of blowing soil. Fields that had once produced crops were being stripped by wind. Dust entered homes. It crossed roads. It darkened the sky. And farmers had to confront a problem that looked different from Patrick Doyle's wet Irish field. Ireland had too much water. The Great Plains could have too little. Ireland had rocky, waterlogged ground. The plains had exposed soil vulnerable to wind. But the underlying question was strangely familiar. How do you make the shape of the land work with nature instead of against it? Farmers began using contouring, strip cropping, terraces, and ridge and furrow approaches to slow water, reduce erosion, and keep precious soil where it belonged. They weren't copying Patrick. Most would never have heard of him. They didn't need to. Desperation had led them toward the same kind of thinking. Change the shape of the field. Slow what moves too quickly. Move what needs moving. Keep the soil where the crop needs it. And don't depend on a single perfect condition. A ridge in Ireland had been built to deal with water. A contour or ridge system on the Great Plains could help deal with wind and runoff. The circumstances were different. The principle was not. Years later, Patrick's original field no longer looked strange. The ridges were simply part of the landscape. Children who had once watched their father or grandfather build them grew up knowing where to walk. Farmers learned which ground was worth the labor, which crops belonged where, which channels needed clearing before the rains. The ridges became ordinary, and that is what happens to useful ideas. First, people laugh at them. Then they question them. Then they copy them. And eventually, everyone forgets that they were ever considered strange. That's what makes Patrick's story worth remembering. Not because one farmer discovered a magical way to defeat famine. He didn't. The blight still came. Families still suffered. The land was still difficult. What Patrick discovered was something quieter. A farm doesn't have to be perfect to be useful. And a farmer doesn't have to control nature to survive it. Sometimes survival means observing carefully enough to cooperate with what the land is already trying to do. The wet ground wants to drain. Give it channels. The dry soil wants to blow. Give it structure. The field wants to erode. Slow the water. The crop fails. Have another one growing beside it. The answer doesn't always come from a bigger machine. Sometimes it comes from a shovel. Sometimes it comes from a ridge. And sometimes it comes from the simple decision not to put everything you have into one thing. And before we finish, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching this story from? We'd genuinely love to see it. Patrick Doyle's ridges did not stop the blight. They did something more practical. They gave his family options when one option disappeared. And almost a century later, farmers facing another environmental disaster arrived at a similar truth. The land could be shaped. Water could be slowed. Wind could be resisted. Soil could be protected. And survival often belonged not to the farmer with the easiest field, but to the farmer who paid the closest attention to the field he actually had. That's the part people forget. The best farmer isn't always the one with the richest soil. Sometimes it's the one who looks at poor ground and asks a better question. Not, why won't this land give me what I want? But, what is this land already trying to tell me? Patrick listened. He built his ridges. And when the harvest failed, they were still standing. Not as a monument to a miracle, but as proof that sometimes the difference between losing everything and having something left is simply knowing how to work with the ground beneath your feet. And perhaps that's why the old ridges deserve to be remembered. They were built by people who had almost nothing. But they understood something that people with far more resources sometimes forget. You don't always survive by conquering the land. Sometimes, you survive by learning how to live with it.